Hey, thank you, Martha. And again, this is Listen and Be Heard Radio on WPVM FM. Today, we're going to be talking poetry.
Mm,
As we speak to a lot of authors, multi-genre. And today, we're going to be talking to uh, an author, a poet who's written a debut poetry collection. She lives in Greensboro, North Carolina, so she's in the state. Um, Late Epistle is the name of this wonderful new collection of poems. Anne Myles is the poet. She is the author of this wonderful new book. I'm going to just read from her bio. Anne
mhm.
Myles, and that's spelled Myles, is the author of "What Woman That Was: Poems for Mary Dyer," which was published by Final Thursday Press in 2022. Her poems have appeared in numerous journals and have been nominated for multiple pushcart prizes. She is Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Northern Iowa and holds a BA from Bryn Mawr College, a PhD from the University of Chicago, and an MFA from Vermont College of Fine Arts. She was raised in Manhattan and New York's Hudson Valley, and she presently lives with her pets in Greensboro, North Carolina. Welcome to our program, Anne.
Thank you. I'm really honored and excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited too. We have a couple of things in common. We both
Mhm,
went to Vermont College of Fine Arts.
mhm,
We both live in North Carolina. Like your
mhm.
last name is Miles. There are some miles between us. I think
Oh.
from Hendersonville to Greensboro, it's about 2 hours and 30 minutes.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
you're from the East Coast, and I am
mhm.
from the West Coast. And
Yeah.
I wanted to start it off by, one of the things that I get drawn in with poets is when they talk about their lives, when they talk
Mhm,
about their childhood, because that's a subject that oftentimes will
mhm,
come up, uh, particularly the subject of parents.
mhm,
And that's one of the subjects that comes through in a late epistle. Parents have flaws and blemishes and imperfections. Talk to us about your childhood and how that time in your life influenced you to
mhm.
become a poet.
Wow. Well, it's just a little bit of framing for people who don't know. I'd say there's a lot in Late Epistle, but the first section in particular, and in some ways the whole book, kind of looks back on my childhood from the near present. And after my parents died in 2015 and 2016, 11 months apart.
Mm,
And, my life changed a lot after that. And so, sort of looking back, thinking about what was my childhood like, what were my parents like, how did that shape who I am. I had what I now recognize as quite a privileged upbringing, though, of course, like everything else, it seemed ordinary at the time. My parents were both physicians in New York. They actually shared a practice together. I used to joke my parents weren't just married; they were incorporated. Um, and so we lived in Manhattan during the week, and I just went to school mostly. I'm an only child. That's probably a big
right.
actual thing, the sort of my parents worked, my mother worked. I had we called her my nursemaid taking care of me during the day. So, I was a kind of solitary kid and read a lot and thought a lot. And then I guess from about the time I was like 6, 7, my parents got a house in the country in Monroe, New York, in the Hudson Valley, an old rambling house on a lake. And pretty much Friday night, we would leave Manhattan and go up there and spend the weekend there. And maybe in the summer, my mom and I would be up for, a few weeks. Um, so so I have these two places, but I think the house on the lake is certainly a large presence in the book. just the time at the lake. I was kind of, a horse girl in my teen years.
Yes,
And
yes,
after,
yes.
I loved being in the country and doing those things. And, I remember my spirit sort of falling when I came back to New York at, Sunday afternoon. Um, so, so yeah, so that was my childhood, so I didn't do like as a teenager, I was up seeing family and doing horse things. I was not in and working very intensely in school. I was not, having relationships or going to parties or having the life that people tend to stereotypically think of as teen life. Um and I think all of that in retrospect probably contributed to my being a poet. I was certainly feeling the stirrings of that identity by, late high school. I was really good at English. And then in
Hmm.
college, um, so, in whatever way. Um, but then it's probably relevant to say that, it's hard to think back on all the factors, but I didn't really pursue poetry right after college. There was a lot going on. I ended up going into a PhD program in English. Um, and somehow, in the course of that and other emotional struggles in that time, I more or less let go of poetry and became a specialist in the field of early American literature.
Mm.
And, my career was in that. And I didn't really go back to poetry until, oh gosh, about 2017, 2018.
Mm.
Um, and that's a story in itself. But the poet was beginning in childhood and then got lost and then came back. And I think there's a lot of the emotion in Late Epistle reflects that sense of loss and recovery.
Well, you started off the book with a poem called House of My Youth, and you had
Hmm.
all of these reasons that, could be interpreted as reasons that you gravitated towards poetry, or perhaps
And
poetry gravitated towards you at the same time.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because let's see, because the window panes were wavy and I learned to see through tears.
Hmm.
It's like, insight, hindsight,
Yeah,
in hindsight and insight and everything in between that,
yeah,
which is a
yeah.
beautiful thing, Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's some of the lines in House of My Youth are, fictionalized or imaginative. But yeah, so I lost my parents in, somewhat difficult traumatic ways in 2015, 2016, and then I was um, left with the house. I inherited the house and, realized in ways that it was not practical for me to keep it or, emotionally I didn't want to, but I was still incredibly attached to it. And so I sold that eventually, amazingly back to there was another family that had owned it from 1917, I think, to
Mm.
1969. And then
Oh,
our
wow.
family got it. And I sold it back to a daughter of that family, which was amazing. Like our house was full of their furniture that it had been sold to us with, and now the furniture like went back to them.
Yeah.
But it was hard losing the house, which meant so much to me. I actually closed on the sale like within a month before starting at Vermont College of Fine Arts. And so, yeah,
I guess, sense of place,
yeah, the
sense of
sense of
place and setting. And let me
right.
let me ask you this, many of your poems, and I was, really moved by the subject matter and the themes that you delve into. You're quite moving. Many of your poems are narrative, but really have a lyrical quality. They are
Mm,
dense in language, but have a liberating quality at the same time. Um, do you prefer narrative poems over lyrical? And what's your process? How do you go about getting it down?
Oh gosh, what's my process? I think it's different every time. I don't know what I prefer. I write what asks to be written.
Mm,
And
yes.
when poetry came back to me, actually, when I first the sense that I had to break out of the kind of academic constraints I had put on my voice and recover my
Mm,
creative voice. I thought I
yes.
was going to do that in sort of memoir, creative nonfiction, or really kind of a hybrid memoir. I wasn't initially thinking I would write poetry, but what came to me was this feeling, incredible drive that I wanted to tell the truth about my life.
Mm,
Not that it was so, dramatic, but just to kind of talk about, I was in my mid 50s by that point, what my experience had been, and things that I had not really spoken about much to anyone or only to my closest friends. So there was that narrative, impulse. And then so I was working on this memoir-ish thing, and then about a year later I sort of wrote a poem, and then I wrote another poem, and then, you know, and it suddenly all came back to me that, oh, poetry, that's like the form I know how to write. That was my form. And my great pleasure in the lyric and sound and
mm.
poetry as kind of the shaped object and the line break, all of that really came back and was a great pleasure. So I think the combination of the narrative and the lyric impulses are just really intertwined in me. Um, I'll say that in writing a poem, I think, I do tend to get an idea or some thoughts or an impulse or a memory, and then I have to start listening in myself for the line, the rhythm, the sound. I think it's hard to write if I don't hear the sound qualities. And, my poems do take a lot of different shapes and lines, and, they're not always defaulting the same. So that's sort of listening to how does this poem want to move, I think is part of my
You
process.
kind of write with your ears in a way, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, you're writing with the ears.
absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
can you talk a little bit about one of the things that in going through the book and getting into the themes and
Mhm,
into the content and the
mhm,
lines and just the rhythm is this sense that I got of the merging of the physical and the spiritual places. There's a
hmm.
merging to me in these poems. Can maybe can you talk about that? Because you can take, I think there was one poem where you took it was a painting by Mark Rothko, I think his name was, right?
Mhm, mhm,
And translating that, a
mhm.
physical thing, and then translating it into a spiritual
Still thing, yeah.
thing. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, that poem, boy, I wrote my whole graduating lecture on that poem or on the issue that that poem raised. Writing about art is, um, yeah, that was a really interesting translation to take an abstract painting and use it as a window into my life, and that had its own concerns. But in terms of places, yeah, I am drawn to places and attached to places. And
Hmm.
I dimly remember, like, even as a young girl, writing a poem, you know, about like a beach or some island we had been to on vacation, and, having left it, and sort of the trying to summon up that intense connection and then the kind of melancholy of not being there anymore. I think in ways, well, we all feel connection to place, and that's a powerful thing. But I think my kind of solitariness and aloneness in much of my life has made me feel companioned by place and attentive to
Mm,
place, or looking for a kind of spiritual connection in place or, nature. Um, because, well, I always am looking, and there are things that I can't really write about because
yeah.
they're not that present for me. Um, so.
That's beautiful. That's very interesting because, in solitude, it's that companionship, right? And
Mhm.
throughout the book, there's a regard for that. There's a regard for nature. There's a regard for those things that make up those spaces. But at the same time, it's not just a one-sided thing. Perhaps those spaces are looking for us in our poetry to
That's a
have a
lovely.
to have a way that we can articulate the the
Mhm.
space that's there and I'm here, but you know it's not really there and here. It's we're immersed in it.
Right.
Um,
Um,
there was one other thing, I kind of it has me want to go on a limb because Clint McCown, who he's one of the advisors at VCFA.
mhm.
He always talked about the he always spoke of setting as like he talked about
Mhm.
it. He said in one of his lectures it was uh, the hydrogen atom of fiction. He said the most
Mhm.
basic element, right?
Mhm.
Um, a very necessary element. Um, can you maybe talk a little bit more about setting because there, I, there's definitely movement in your experience. There's definitely movement in your life going from
Mhm.
this place to that place. Maybe some of
Mhm.
the things that influence. I mean, there's a poem in here called Fairyville, and you have a line in
Mhm.
here that's beautiful. It goes, it says, metaphor, another fairy, I can't stop boarding, as if it,
Mhm.
as if it fixed things, as if it could tell me where I am.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. The little playing, with the root of metaphor is to carry across. It is a kind
Mm,
of,
hmm.
ferrying in that notion, and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
really played with it there. Yeah. Um, trying to think. Yeah, it is funny because a lot of people, for them, place, it's sort of their writing rooted in one place, but because I am looking back on a lot of my life which has not been in one place, there are multiple places here. There's a lot of the New York City and New York State, the childhood, and until recently I lived in that place. And then there are quite a number of poems that reflect the Midwest, where I lived. I mean, I lived in Chicago in my through most of my 20s into my early 30s, um, and then I was in New Jersey for a few years, and then um, I lived in Iowa for, I think, 22 years. And so there are a lot of poems about that. And then recently, now I'm in North Carolina, and there are a
yeah, yeah.
couple of poems that reflect that at the end. I barely learned how to, write about North Carolina yet. But there's something about the spaciousness of Iowa, which is a very beautiful state in a way. The rolling hills, the sort of the horizon is always there, the openness, the plainness. And as I began writing again, well, maybe even before, I became so aware that that kind of openness, emptiness, um, harshness in the winter felt like a sort of spiritual analogy for me. I really connected to it and thought a lot about my own kind of yearning and the landscape in different ways. And then, when I started writing, much of the time, that I was at Vermont College, was during the pandemic. So I was
Yes,
even
yeah.
more isolated, but you could go out and drive around, um, and, look at things and be outside safely. So I did a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, many of the poems are introspective and revelatory.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you talk about the landscape, the Midwest of grief, for
Mm-hmm.
instance,
Yeah.
that poem, you know, you're talking about a landscape. You're describing the farmhouses and the sky, but
Mm-hmm.
as I'm reading it, it's as if I'm entering your spiritual and
Mm-hmm.
emotional landscape, that you're
Mm-hmm.
using, you know, the landscape, the outer landscape to inform the interior. Which
Mm-hmm.
brings me to the next question. Your poems, uh, you know, the themes of your poems, um, there it seems to be like a mirroring of the interior and the exterior, right? With the exterior becomes the interior and vice versa. The poet becomes an interior exterior decorator, for lack of a better thing. But our decor, our decor as poets, right, is tragedy, irony, love, loss, vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
Are there certain themes that kind of take more of command with your writing than others? Are there certain themes that you are
Mm-hmm.
more comfortable with?
Um, I'm thinking about this word comfortable, and you know, a lot of the writing in the book and sort of moving beyond the looking back to childhood stuff does deal with themes of love and loss and longing and kind of obsession. Uh, there are poems, I identify as lesbian, and there are poems about sexuality and my fairly late coming out. But I think in a lot of ways, the emotional engine, and this is hard to talk about, is really decades of a kind of, I don't know, obsession might sound too fancy, but I can't think of a better word, but longing for an unavailable and inappropriate object, from my 20s, a woman, actually a therapist, I'll say it,
Mm,
who left
mm,
rather traumatically, and whom I longed for, or for a sort of image, a almost spiritualized muse-like image of her. I really longed for decades, and that that longing and the grief that was such a part of my 20s, but that I really kept to myself, was something that when I started writing again, I had a very strong drive to talk about. But am I comfortable talking about that? Absolutely not. I It was really scary and vulnerable, um, to talk about that. There were a few times in my MFA studies where I really, you know, almost had a meltdown at how terrifying it was to to write this stuff, or to write it and think of anyone reading it. So that material is something that I still can feel a lot of poetry comes out of and kind of emotionally underlies it. And then, ironically, one of the poems that in some ways was the most explicit about this and was the scariest to write, and was one of the ones I did have kind of a meltdown about, became the title poem. Late Epistle is a poem that really terrified me, and I did not plan that it would be the title of the book, but I was struggling for a title, and that ended up emerging. So
so, so the title of the book um, is okay. So that was one of the poems in the book.
yeah, that's a poem in the third section, um,
Oh,
in which,
page 61. Yeah.
yeah, in which I sort of try to say goodbye to, or expunge some of those those emotions. I won't say I've necessarily done so as perfectly as the poem might imply. Um, but coming to terms with all of that, and actually having tried to written a real life letter to this person whom I hadn't been in touch with for several decades, and getting a kind but painful response back, in some ways was one of the big triggers for my return to writing,
Mm,
um, ironically, to lay claim to that story, what it had meant to me, to tell it that as a writer, I had the right to tell that story in my own way, to lay claim to those emotions. Um, that was part of what brought me back to poetry, and it definitely feels like part of this book, even though it's scary, and it taught me a lot about, being vulnerable and moving towards the things that are scary to write about.
well, it's really it's moving. Many of these poems are moving. They're very personal, and they come from a place of where I feel like, wow, I was reading some of these and I thought, wow, I really took something to write this. You
Mm-hmm.
really had to, really dig deep and find it. And sometimes it takes a long time to find it. Hence, late epistle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where everything comes in its time, its appropriate
Yeah.
time, when you're ready, and when I
Mm-hmm.
guess when the world and when the world is ready, we'll know deep
Mm-hmm.
down. Um, I wanted
Yeah.
to just also ask you too, about or actually, it sounded like you may have had something else you wanted to say about that.
Well, I just want to say that, I think the late epistle, and so there was that one epistolary letter poem, that
Right, yeah,
does address someone, but there also has been this desire I've had to connect, to reach out, to speak to others, and that idea that maybe if I speak to others through my poems, they
yeah.
will listen, there'll be that connection. And so in that way too, the book is a late epistle, well, I'm not at death's door, but I'm 60 now. And so it feels like, late to finally start doing this,
Yeah.
really reaching out to the world, and, you know,
And in reflection,
speaking.
in these poems
Mhm,
and being being reflective, I feel like in these pages you really achieve you really achieve a sense of grace without
mhm,
without forcing it. I mean, you're telling
mhm,
it in a way that's such that is it's you saying it. You're not
mhm,
it's no template. It's just coming from
mhm,
you, and I think
mhm,
you've achieved a lot of grace with this. I think this is going to help a lot of people because I know that there are a lot of people
mhm,
that have been in this same damn
mhm,
situation, have felt
mhm,
what you felt, and
mhm,
it's worded and crafted in such a way where, you know, a person can really latch on to it and feel it.
mhm,
I wanted to ask you as well. I know that you were in academia and you had
mhm,
the academic, the academic straitjacket and
mhm,
constraints. Um, can you just tell us? I mean, I was in the MFA program, the same one as you,
mhm,
right? Vermont
mhm,
College. Um, overall, what that experience is like, because there might be some of our listeners that might be
mhm,
considering going into
mhm,
an MFA program in creative writing. You know, maybe the differences between transitioning between
mhm,
being a professor and then going into
mhm,
an MFA program, and
mhm.
if there may be some things that if given another chance, you may have done different. As
Yeah.
far as your experience.
Um, I mean, overall, I loved it, and I mean, it was pretty radical, right? I retired early from a tenured professor position. Um, so it feels like I kind of threw away my career because when writing came back and the grace of that, I just needed to go towards it. And so I was so happy to be in the program, and then, the pandemic, but it gave me something to feel connected to. And um, it was very good. I mean, I have to say it's probably a little different for me in that, the more academic aspects of it were not particularly challenging to me, and maybe I wish they were a little more, but when you have a PhD in English going backwards to a master's degree, and it was a little weird socially, right? Ironically, I was the graduate coordinator in my university of my program, so I like cracked the whip over MA English students. So to go from being, graduate coordinator
Yeah,
to a master's student myself,
yeah.
was a little odd. And it was a little odd to be in this student teacher relationship with people who would have been my colleagues socially. And, that had some awkward elements. But I liked it. I loved the intimacy, the one-on-one intimacy of working with one's advisor. It
Hmm.
felt sort of half like academia and half like therapy in that, intense dyadic fraught relationship. And I felt the first time I was there, I remember my first residency looking around and seeing all these other people and realizing I could be as weird as I was or as I wanted to be, and it'd be okay because we were all writers and our
Hmm.
weirdness fed that. And that was just an amazing feeling. I was so happy. Um,
No, I totally get it. Um, we're gonna have to wrap up again. Like I
mhm,
said, this is Listen and Be Heard Radio, Late Epistle. This is a wonderful book. It is the debut poetry collection by Ann Myles. That's Ann with an E. Last name is spelled Myles. You can check her out online. She does have a web. Well, Ann, why don't you give us your website?
okay. Well, it's going to be easy. As long as you know to spell my name, you can find it easily. It's annmiles.com. Um,
AnnMyles.com. Once again,
mm,
there are news and events on her website as well as samples
mhm,
of her writing. If you're interested in getting Late Epistle
mhm,
or any of her other books, she also had a chapbook out that
mhm,
came out. What was the
mhm.
name of the chapbook?
What Woman That Was, Poems for Mary Dyer,
Mm.
and
And
book I'm really proud of. Yeah.
that was published in 2022 by
Yeah, it was published
Final
about
Thursday Press. Yeah.
a year ago by a small press connected with my former university, but it's a book that's still having a real continuing life, and I'm
Mhm.
very proud of that one as well.
This website has Ann's email address. So if you're
Mhm,
interested in having her, for a reading or
mhm,
like a panel discussion,
mhm,
please feel free to log on. Again, it's annmiles.com. That's Ann with an E and Miles with a Y. Annmiles.com. Again, Late Epistle. This is just a moving collection. It's a debut collection of poetry. Thank you so much, Anne, for being on our program. I do want to shout out Vermont College of Fine Arts since we're both alum. Want to say
mhm,
hello to VCFA. We haven't forgotten you
mhm.
guys. And anyway, Late Epistle, the winner of the Sappho's Prize in Poetry by Ann Myles, and it is published by Headmistress Press. And again, this is Listen and Be Heard Radio on WPVM 103.7 FM, the voice of Asheville. And that's a voice that can be heard throughout the world on WPVMFM.org. And right now, we're going to toss it back to the studio and Martha.